Sandra Bullock had decided to take a break from the chaos of her busy life in Hollywood. It wasn't often that she had the chance to enjoy a peaceful evening, so when the opportunity arose, she took it. On a cool evening in Los Angeles, Sandra, dressed in simple, comfortable clothes, ventured out to one of the quieter, more intimate restaurants in the city. She was joined by a close friend who she had known for years. This was supposed to be just a relaxing dinner, a moment to unwind without any spotlight or attention. The restaurant, located on a tree-lined street, was known for its charming ambience and warm lighting. It wasn't one of those flashy, trendy places filled with paparazzi and fans. It was the perfect spot for Sandra to escape her celebrity status for a while. She was looking forward to enjoying the evening without being recognized, hoping for a night where she could just be a regular person. When Sandra walked in, she was greeted by the hostess with a smile. "A table for two?" the hostess asked. Sandra nodded and followed her to a quiet corner in the back, far from the bustling kitchen and loud conversations. Her friend pulled out a chair for her, and she sat down, taking in the cozy surroundings. The restaurant had an old-world charm, with dark wooden furniture, soft music playing in the background, and candles flickering on each table. It was a peaceful setting, just what Sandra needed to relax. As she sat back in her chair, Sandra couldn't help but enjoy the quiet, the absence of flashing cameras and noisy crowds. She felt comfortable here, and for the first time in a while, she could truly just be herself. They ordered a bottle of wine and began chatting, catching up on life. It wasn't about movies or fame. It was about their old memories, their shared experiences, and how things had changed over the years. Sandra smiled, happy to be having a normal conversation for once. However, despite the peace she was seeking, it wasn't long before things took an unexpected turn. A waiter approached their table, a young man with a slightly disinterested look on his face. He seemed distracted, barely making eye contact as he took their drink order. Sandra thought nothing of it at first. She assumed he was just busy. But as the evening went on, she began to notice something different in the way he interacted with her. The waiter was polite but distant, almost as if he didn't care about giving good service. Sandra wasn't bothered at first, thinking maybe he was just having an off day. But as he came back to their table a few times, his attitude started to feel a little colder. He didn't seem to recognize who she was, which in some ways was a blessing. But in other ways, his lack of warmth and interest in providing a good experience made her feel uneasy. She brushed it off, telling herself that not every person in the world needed to know who she was. It was clear that this evening wasn't going to be as relaxing as she had hoped. Little did Sandra know, this was only the beginning of an unexpected and uncomfortable night. As the evening went on, Sandra tried her best to remain relaxed, despite the growing tension she felt from the waiter's behavior. He seemed to take his time with everything, moving slowly, almost as if he were intentionally dragging his feet. When he brought their appetizers, he placed them on the table without a word, barely glancing at Sandra or her friend. There was no polite greeting, no asking if they needed anything, just a quick "here's your food" before he turned to leave. Sandra, who had spent years in the public eye, was used to people treating her differently. She had seen both the best and worst of how people treated celebrities. Some were genuinely kind, while others saw her as nothing more than a paycheck or a chance to make a scene. But this waiter wasn't acting like a typical fan or even a typical person who was just doing his job. He seemed to be indifferent, almost condescending, like he was irritated by their presence. She thought it might be a mistake, or maybe he was just having a bad night. She glanced over at her friend, who seemed to notice the strange vibe too, but neither of them wanted to make a fuss. It wasn't like Sandra to cause a scene, and she certainly didn't want to make her friend feel uncomfortable either. So she kept her thoughts to herself, taking a deep breath and focusing on enjoying the evening. However, things didn't improve. The waiter returned to their table a few more times, each time with the same cold attitude. When he brought their main courses, he seemed more preoccupied with something else than with his actual job. He didn't ask how the meal was or if they needed anything. Sandra and her friend exchanged a look, both wondering what had gotten into the waiter. But still, Sandra didn't say anything. She didn't want to escalate the situation for something so small. At one point, the waiter even made an eye roll, seemingly annoyed that they were taking up space in the restaurant. Sandra tried to ignore it, but she could feel the discomfort growing. She wasn't the type to let a little rudeness ruin her mood, but the vibe in the room had changed. There was an unspoken tension in the air, and it was impossible to ignore. Just when Sandra thought she couldn't stand it anymore, the waiter crossed a line. He returned to their table, and this time, his attitude was even worse. He made a snide comment under his breath, something that Sandra wasn't sure was meant to be heard, but it was loud enough that it couldn't be ignored. It was a subtle jab, something dismissive about entitled celebrities and getting preferential treatment. Sandra's face flushed with surprise and hurt. She had been patient, trying to let his behavior slide. But now, this was too much. Her friend raised an eyebrow, noticing the shift in Sandra's demeanor. Sandra, though taken aback, didn't immediately react. She held back, keeping her emotions in check. She had dealt with worse in her career, but for some reason, this particular encounter stung more than she expected. Perhaps it was because she had come here seeking peace, not to feel alienated by someone who clearly didn't care to show her any respect. Just as Sandra was about to let the incident pass and focus on her meal, a familiar voice interrupted the uncomfortable silence at their table. Well, if it isn't the lovely Sandra Bullock. Keanu Reeves, Sandra's longtime friend and co-star from Speed and The Lake House, stepped into the restaurant, his warm smile instantly lighting up the room. Sandra's face softened at the sight of him. It was a relief to see a friendly face amidst the awkwardness that had been building up throughout the evening. Keanu had been in the neighborhood, and upon hearing that Sandra was dining at the same restaurant, he decided to pop in and surprise her. He was one of the few people who could make Sandra feel like she wasn't in the public eye. She had always admired Keanu's down-to-earth nature, his genuine kindness, and his ability to stay humble despite his global fame. He wasn't the kind of person to make a big entrance, but when he did, it was always with a sense of calm and respect that put others at ease. As Keanu made his way toward their table, the waiter, who had been hovering nearby, suddenly stiffened. He hadn't recognized Sandra at first, but now he was fully aware of who she was. And seeing Keanu walk up to her table, his easygoing demeanor a stark contrast to his own, caused him to pause for a moment. Sandra's friend looked at Keanu with a knowing smile. Keanu, after all, had a way of making people feel safe and seen, no matter who they were. "Hey, Sandra, how's it going?" Keanu asked, pulling out a chair without missing a beat. He was genuinely interested in hearing about how she was doing. Sandra smiled, grateful for the distraction. "I'm doing well, Keanu. Just trying to enjoy a quiet dinner, but it seems my peaceful evening has been interrupted," she said with a chuckle, not wanting to dwell on the awkwardness with the waiter. Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Interrupted, huh? By who?" Sandra hesitated for a moment, but then she decided to explain, pointing to the waiter who had just dropped off their plates. "That guy over there," she said, trying to be as discreet as possible. "He's been acting strange the whole time. At first I thought it was just me, but now I'm not so sure." Keanu followed her gaze, noting the waiter's lack of attention and his indifferent attitude. Keanu's expression didn't change, but Sandra could see that he wasn't happy about it. He turned back to Sandra with a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, I've got this." He stood up, excusing himself for a moment. Sandra wasn't sure what he was planning, but she trusted Keanu completely. He had a way of handling situations like this with grace and dignity, never resorting to drama or confrontation, but always standing up for what was right. Keanu calmly walked toward the waiter, who was still lingering nearby, not realizing what was about to unfold. Sandra and her friend exchanged glances, both curious to see how Keanu would handle the situation. Keanu had always been the type to approach things with a level head, but this time there was something different in the air, something that told Sandra this was about to get interesting. It wasn't just about the rude waiter anymore. It was about standing up for respect, kindness, and the little things that made life better. And Keanu, as always, was ready to make sure that those things weren't overlooked. Keanu walked over to the waiter with his usual calm demeanor, but there was an unmistakable seriousness in his step. Sandra watched from her table, her heart rate picking up a little as she wondered what would happen next. She knew Keanu, of course. He was a quiet and humble person, always graceful in every situation. But there was something about this moment that felt like more than just a casual conversation. The atmosphere around the table had shifted, and it was clear that Keanu wasn't about to let the waiter's behavior slide without saying something. The waiter, who had been lingering near the bar, looked up when he saw Keanu walking toward him. For a moment, he seemed taken aback, not fully understanding why the actor was heading in his direction. He'd been too busy with his own attitude to recognize that this wasn't just any celebrity. This was someone who, by all accounts, was a kind, respectful person who had no time for negativity or disrespect. Keanu reached the waiter's side, and without raising his voice or making a scene, he spoke in a calm, controlled tone. "Hey, listen," he started, looking directly at the young man. "I don't know what's going on, but the way you're treating Sandra right now isn't right. She's here trying to enjoy a quiet dinner, and she doesn't deserve to be treated like this." Keanu's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a firmness that made it clear he wasn't simply pointing out the issue. He was calling for it to be addressed. The waiter's face flushed with discomfort. He stammered, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed to come out in a coherent manner. I didn't mean," he began, but Keanu cut him off with a gentle but direct response. "It doesn't matter what you meant. What matters is how you've made her feel. We all have bad days, sure, but that doesn't excuse being rude to someone who's simply here for a meal. It's not about who she is or what she does. It's about treating people with basic respect." Sandra, still sitting at the table, felt a wave of relief wash over her. Keanu's words were exactly what she needed to hear, but she hadn't expected him to step in so directly. The waiter, clearly embarrassed now, looked down at the floor, his face red. Sandra could tell he was realizing just how far he had crossed the line. "I'm sorry," the waiter said quietly, finally looking up at Keanu. "I didn't mean to disrespect anyone. I've just had a rough night, and I guess I let it get the best of me." Keanu nodded, accepting the apology. "I understand that. We all have our moments," he replied. "But next time, just remember that kindness goes a long way. It'll make your night better too." He gave the waiter a small, reassuring smile before turning back toward Sandra and her friend. Sandra watched as Keanu made his way back to their table, the tension in the air slowly dissipating. The waiter, still red-faced, stood for a moment, clearly processing what had just happened. Keanu had handled the situation with such grace that Sandra couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. Keanu had spoken up not just for her, but for the idea that every person, celebrity or not, deserved to be treated with respect and kindness. When Keanu returned to the table, he didn't make a big deal out of it. He simply sat down, a slight grin on his face. "Well, that should be the end of that," he said, making light of the situation. Sandra couldn't help but laugh, the tension from earlier fading away completely. "You know, I'm glad I wasn't alone tonight," she said, looking at him with appreciation. "You really know how to handle things." Keanu shrugged modestly. "It's nothing. Just the right thing to do." The evening had taken a strange turn, but Sandra felt a sense of calm settle over her once again. She knew that no matter what happened, she could always count on Keanu to be there, not just as a friend, but as someone who would always stand up for what was right, without hesitation. As Sandra and Keanu settled back into their conversation, the mood at the table lightened. The brief confrontation with the waiter had disappeared into the past, and now the two of them were enjoying the warmth of their friendship. Sandra couldn't help but smile at how easily Keanu had handled the situation. His calmness, his unwavering sense of fairness, had diffused the tension without making a scene or causing any unnecessary drama. It was exactly why she had always admired him. "You know," Sandra said, taking a sip of her wine, "I don't know what I would have done without you. That guy was really pushing my patience." She shook her head slightly, a playful smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "But you just walked in, and everything changed." Keanu chuckled, waving off the compliment. "It's nothing," he said modestly. "You know I'm always here for you." His voice carried a warmth that made Sandra feel like nothing could possibly go wrong. That was the magic of Keanu. He had a way of making people feel safe and valued, no matter the situation. They continued to chat, catching up on life as they always did when they were together. Sandra talked about her recent projects, how she had been spending more time with family and friends, and how she was looking forward to taking on new challenges. Keanu listened attentively, offering thoughtful responses, and always asking questions that showed he genuinely cared about what was happening in her life. As they talked, Sandra's mind kept drifting back to the earlier incident with the waiter. Even though it was over, the words Keanu had spoken kept playing in her head. His firm yet kind reminder about respect had struck a chord with her. It wasn't just the waiter who needed to hear that message. It was something everyone needed to be reminded of from time to time. People often got caught up in their own frustrations, their own struggles, and forgot the simple importance of treating others with kindness. Keanu's example had been a perfect one. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a big deal out of the situation. Instead, he had approached it with understanding, showing the waiter that everyone could have bad moments, but that didn't mean it was okay to take them out on others. It was a powerful reminder of the kind of person Keanu was, always striving to make the world a little better with every interaction. The two friends continued talking, laughing over shared memories and recalling funny stories from their past. They reminisced about their time on set together, the long days and even longer nights, and the adventures they had shared off-screen. Sandra felt grateful for the quiet moments like this, where she could just be herself, surrounded by people she trusted and admired. Their meal was nearly finished when the waiter returned to their table. He was no longer the same person he had been earlier. His posture was more open, his demeanor calmer. He seemed genuinely apologetic, and Sandra could tell he had taken Keanu's words to heart. "I just wanted to apologize again," the waiter said, his voice much softer now. "I didn't mean to upset you, and I really appreciate your patience." He looked at Sandra, his eyes sincere. "I'll do better next time." Sandra smiled warmly at him, not wanting to hold on to any negativity. "It's okay," she said kindly. "We all have our moments. I appreciate you taking the time to apologize." She could see the waiter relax a little, relieved that the tension was gone. It was a simple moment, but it was one that made a difference, both for Sandra and for the young man who had learned an important lesson that night. Keanu, who had been watching quietly, gave a small nod of approval. "Good to hear," he said, before turning back to Sandra. "Now, how about we finish this meal in peace?" Sandra laughed, the evening now feeling exactly how she had hoped it would. Quiet, relaxed, and full of good conversation. The earlier tension had melted away, leaving behind only the warmth of friendship and the kind of respect that made all the difference in the world. She knew that moments like these were rare and precious, and she was thankful for them. As they finished their meal, Sandra couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the unexpected turn of events. What had started as a stressful night had ended up being a beautiful reminder of the power of kindness and the importance of standing up for what's right. As the evening wore on, Sandra and Keanu continued to enjoy each other's company, the atmosphere around their table now filled with ease and laughter. The restaurant had settled into a peaceful rhythm once more, with the occasional clink of silverware and the soft hum of quiet conversations in the background. The world outside seemed far away, and in this little corner of the restaurant, everything felt just right. Sandra, feeling more relaxed than she had all evening, leaned back in her chair and let out a contented sigh. "This," she said, gesturing to the cozy atmosphere, "this is exactly what I needed. Just some peace and quiet, and good company. Keanu nodded, his easy smile spreading across his face. I'm glad to hear that. Sometimes, we all need a little reset, don't we? He took a sip of his drink, his expression thoughtful. Life can get pretty hectic, especially for someone like you. Always in the public eye, always on the go. Sandra's smile faded for just a moment as she thought about the pressures of being in the spotlight. It wasn't easy, even though she had learned to handle the attention over the years. It does get exhausting, she admitted. Sometimes I feel like I'm just going through the motions. You try to keep up with everything, to make sure you're not letting anyone down. And then, it's like you forget to take a step back and breathe. Keanu looked at her with understanding in his eyes. I can imagine, he said quietly, but you're one of the most grounded people I know. You always manage to stay true to yourself, no matter what the world throws at you. That's something a lot of people can't do. Sandra smiled at his words, grateful for the compliment. It's not always easy, she replied, but I try. It's the people around me, like you, that keep me grounded. You've always had this way of reminding me to slow down, to enjoy the little things. I appreciate that more than you know. Keanu shrugged, as if it were no big deal. It's just what friends do. Besides, you've been through a lot, Sandra. You deserve a break every now and then. He paused for a moment, then added with a playful grin, and hey, you've earned it. You've done more than enough for the world. Sandra laughed lightly, her earlier tension completely gone. I suppose that's true, she said, but sometimes I think the real challenge is remembering to take a break when I need it. It's easy to get caught up in the rush of everything. They both fell quiet for a moment, lost in their own thoughts. Sandra's mind wandered to all the things she had accomplished over the years, the films, the awards, the recognition. It was easy to get swept up in it all, to think that every decision and every action had to live up to some larger expectation. But sitting there with Keanu, in the warmth of the restaurant, she realized how important it was to just let go sometimes, to embrace the simple moments that made life truly meaningful. So, Keanu said, breaking the silence, what's next for you? Any exciting projects coming up? He leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. Sandra smiled, grateful for the shift in conversation. Actually, yes, she said. I've been thinking a lot about doing something different, something a little more personal, you know. Maybe stepping behind the camera for a change, directing or producing. Her eyes lit up as she spoke, the spark of new possibilities shining through. It's a big step, but I think it's time to explore new things. I'm ready for the challenge. Keanu's eyes brightened with approval. That sounds amazing. You've always had such a great eye for detail, and you're such a strong storyteller. I have no doubt you'll be great at it. Sandra felt a rush of gratitude at his words. It wasn't just the compliment. It was the encouragement, the belief that Keanu had always shown in her, even when she doubted herself. She realized how lucky she was to have a friend like him, someone who didn't just cheer her on from the sidelines, but genuinely supported her in whatever direction she chose to take. Thanks, Keanu, she said, her voice soft. That means a lot to me. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, letting the conversation shift to lighter topics. It felt like they had come full circle. What had started as an evening filled with tension and discomfort had transformed into a reminder of the value of true friendship, of kindness, and of the importance of slowing down and taking a breath every once in a while. As they finished their meal and the last of their wine, Sandra felt at peace. She had come to the restaurant hoping for a quiet, stress-free night, but she had gotten so much more than that. She had found comfort in her friend's company, and perhaps more importantly, she had rediscovered the importance of caring for herself and embracing the moments that made life special. As they neared the end of their meal, the conversation naturally began to slow. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted completely from the awkwardness of earlier to one of warmth and camaraderie. It was clear that Sandra and Keanu had found a peaceful rhythm again, where words were no longer necessary to fill the silence. It was the kind of friendship that didn't need constant chatter to be meaningful. The comfort of just being in each other's presence was enough. Sandra glanced out the window, her mind drifting for a moment. The soft glow of the streetlights outside painted a peaceful scene, and for a brief instant, she found herself appreciating the simplicity of the moment. It was easy to forget how rare these moments could be when life moved so quickly. She had spent so much time focusing on the next big project, the next film, the next event, that she often forgot to pause and take in the small things, the quiet dinners, the laughter shared with friends, the rare moments when everything seemed to slow down. Keanu noticed her thoughtful expression and gave her a small, knowing smile. "You're quiet," he said, his voice soft. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Sandra turned back to him, her smile gentle. "Just thinking," she said with a small shrug. "Sometimes I get so caught up in everything, I forget to just be. It's nice to have nights like this where I can just relax and remember what's important." Keanu nodded, his gaze understanding. "It's easy to forget, but it's moments like this that help remind us what really matters." He leaned back in his chair, looking content. "Don't forget to keep those moments for yourself, no matter how busy things get." Sandra smiled, grateful for the reminder. "I'll try," she promised. "It's just hard sometimes, you know. There's always something else to do, something else to accomplish. And when you're in the public eye, it feels like you're always under a microscope." Keanu chuckled lightly, his eyes twinkling with his usual humor. "I get that. But I think you're doing just fine. You're one of the most real people I know, despite all the craziness that surrounds you. And that's not easy to do." Sandra felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. It wasn't often that people saw past the surface, that they recognized the effort it took to stay grounded while being constantly in the public's gaze. She had always prided herself on being authentic, but sometimes it was nice to hear that someone else noticed. The waiter returned once again, this time with the check, his demeanor still noticeably more relaxed than before. He looked at Sandra and Keanu, offering a polite smile. "I hope everything was to your liking," he said, his tone much friendlier than it had been earlier. Sandra gave him a soft smile in return, happy that the awkwardness had passed. "It was perfect, thank you," she said graciously. Keanu nodded in agreement. "You did a great job tonight. Thanks for taking care of us." The waiter's face brightened, and he seemed genuinely relieved that everything was resolved. "I'm glad to hear that. And again, I apologize for earlier. It won't happen again." Sandra gave him a reassuring nod. "No harm done," she said. "We all have off days." Keanu added with a chuckle, "It's all about how you bounce back." With the check settled, the evening was winding down. As Keanu and Sandra stood up to leave, Sandra felt a sense of gratitude. What had started as an uncomfortable and frustrating situation had turned into something far more meaningful. She had been reminded of the importance of standing up for kindness and respect, of the simple joy that came from sharing time with a friend, and of the power of taking a moment to breathe and reflect. As they walked toward the door, Keanu turned to her with a grin. "So, what's next for us? A walk under the stars? Maybe a cup of coffee?" Sandra laughed, feeling lighter than she had all evening. "That sounds perfect," she said. "Let's enjoy the night while we can." As they stepped outside, the cool evening air wrapped around them, and the world seemed just a little bit quieter. The city's bustle was distant, and for the first time in a long time, Sandra felt like she was exactly where she needed to be, surrounded by good company, in a peaceful moment, with nothing to rush toward. It was a rare gift, and for tonight, Sandra was determined to enjoy every bit of it. As Sandra and Keanu stepped out onto the quiet street, the world outside seemed to welcome them with a calm embrace. The evening air was crisp and fresh, a perfect contrast to the warmth they had just left behind in the restaurant. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the soft hum of the city felt distant and almost peaceful, as if the noise of everyday life had momentarily paused just for them. Keanu glanced over at Sandra, noticing how relaxed she looked now. Her earlier tension had melted away, and her smile was genuine, the kind that came from feeling truly at ease. "So," Keanu began, his voice light and playful, "how about that walk? I know a little park nearby, if you're up for it." Sandra laughed softly, enjoying the easy banter. "Sounds perfect," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I've always enjoyed walking at night. It helps me clear my mind." They started walking slowly down the street, side by side. The city around them was a familiar sight, its streets, its buildings, its rhythms. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt like everything had slowed down, like they were just two friends enjoying the simplicity of the moment, without any distractions or expectations. As they walked, Sandra reflected on the evening. It had been unexpected in so many ways. The tension with the waiter, which had initially made her uncomfortable, had been diffused so effortlessly by Keanu. His calm demeanor had turned what could have been a stressful situation into something that ended on a positive note. And now, as they strolled through the quiet streets, she realized just how much she valued these moments of peace. "You know," Sandra said after a moment, her voice thoughtful, "I don't get many nights like this. It's always something, a meeting, an event, something to prepare for. But tonight feels different. It feels good." Keanu smiled, his hands tucked casually into his jacket pockets. "I get that," he said. "Life has a way of speeding up when you're not looking, and before you know it, you've missed the little moments. But tonight, you've got the right idea. Taking it slow, enjoying the little things." Sandra nodded in agreement. "Exactly. I think we could all use a little more of that. Life doesn't have to be one big rush." They continued walking in comfortable silence for a while, just taking in the surroundings. The park Keanu had mentioned was just a few blocks away, and as they neared it, they could hear the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. The park was small but beautiful, with a few benches scattered under trees and a walking path that wound around a small pond. It was quiet, peaceful, and felt like a secret haven in the middle of the city. Keanu motioned toward one of the benches. "How about we sit for a bit?" he asked. "Take in the night." Sandra smiled and nodded. They sat down together, the world around them feeling even quieter in the park. For a while, neither of them said anything. They simply sat, watching the stars above and listening to the sound of the leaves rustling in the trees. Sandra took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. "You know," she said after a while, her voice soft, "I think I needed this more than I realized. Just time to sit, to think, without having to worry about the next thing on my to-do list." Keanu glanced at her, his expression kind. "We all need time like this, to reset, to remember what really matters." Sandra turned to him with a grateful smile. "I don't know what I would have done without you tonight, Keanu. You really know how to make everything seem better. You have this way of putting things into perspective." Keanu shrugged, his smile modest. "It's easy when you're as good a friend as you are. Besides, you've always had that strength inside you. Sometimes, it just takes a reminder." Sandra sat quietly for a moment, taking in his words. She had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to handle challenges on her own. But tonight, she realized how much she appreciated the support of someone who truly understood her. Keanu had always been there for her, not just in the good times, but also when things got tough. It was a rare gift, one she didn't take for granted. They sat there for a little while longer, talking about life, about future plans, and about all the little things that made them both who they were. As the night deepened, Sandra felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. The world outside the park still hummed with activity, but here, in this quiet corner of the city, everything felt calm and right. Finally, as the chill of the night began to settle in, they stood up and began walking back toward the restaurant. "Thank you, Keanu," Sandra said, her voice sincere, "for everything. I really needed this." Keanu smiled warmly at her. Anytime, Sandra. Anytime. And with that, they walked back into the night, side by side, ready to face whatever came next, together.